In 2017, one of America's biggest biotech names, Celgene Corporation, was forced into the spotlight, not for a medical breakthrough, but for a massive fraud settlement. The company agreed to pay $280 million to resolve claims that it illegally promoted cancer drugs for uses never approved by the FDA. At the heart of this story is a whistleblower, allegations of kickbacks, and a legal battle that spanned years. This isn't just a tale about corporate greed, it's a case study in how the health system can be manipulated at the highest levels. The Celgene fraud case centers on allegations that the company promoted two cancer drugs, Thalomid and Revlimid, for unapproved uses, a practice known as off-label marketing. Filed under the False Claims Act by whistleblower Beverly Brown, a former sales manager, the lawsuit claimed Celgene paid doctors speaking fees, consulting arrangements, and other incentives to encourage prescriptions. Prosecutors alleged that these actions led to false claims being submitted to Medicare, Medicaid, and other government healthcare programs. The whistleblower lawsuit was initially filed in 2010 under seal and unsealed in 2014. Despite the U.S. government declining to take over the case, Brown and her legal team pressed on independently, a rare move in such high-stakes litigation. On July 24, 2017, Celgene agreed to pay $280 million to settle the claims without admitting liability. The settlement distributed approximately $259.3 million to the federal government and $20.7 million to 28 states and the District of Columbia. The case became one of the largest, non-intervened, False Claims Act settlements in U.S. history, raising questions about pharmaceutical marketing ethics, corporate accountability, and the influence of money in medicine. The early rumblings. In the world of big pharma, whispers can travel faster than a New York minute, especially when those whispers come from inside the boardroom. Around 2010, Beverly Brown, a sales manager at Celgene Corporation, decided she'd heard enough. She had worked closely with the company's marketing efforts for two of its key drugs, Thalomid and Revlimid. Both drugs had legitimate, FDA-approved uses, primarily in the treatment of certain cancers like multiple myeloma. But according to Brown, Celgene's marketing machine was stretching those uses like a too-small sweater on laundry day, pushing the drugs for medical conditions the FDA had never signed off on. That practice, known as off-label marketing, isn't just frowned upon in the pharmaceutical industry, it's outright illegal when it leads to false claims to government programs like Medicare and Medicaid. Doctors are allowed to prescribe drugs off-label if they believe it will help the patient, but companies are forbidden from actively promoting such uses. In 2010, Beverly Brown filed a sealed lawsuit in federal court under the False Claims Act. For those new to legal jargon, the False Claims Act is like the government's very own crime-sniffing hound. It lets private citizens, known as relators or whistleblowers, sue on behalf of the United States if they believe taxpayer money is being scammed. If the case succeeds, the whistleblower gets a cut of the winnings. Brown's lawsuit alleged several things. 1. Off-label promotion. Celgene was allegedly training its sales reps to pitch Thalomid and Revlimid for unapproved cancers and conditions. 2. Kickbacks. The company allegedly paid physicians in the form of speaking fees, consulting arrangements, lavish dinners, and grants to encourage more prescriptions. 3. False claim submission. As a result of the marketing and kickbacks, Celgene allegedly caused doctors to bill government health programs for treatments not covered under approved guidelines. Her attorneys would later claim that Celgene's internal culture encouraged reps to think outside the label, a cute motivational line in a sales meeting, but in the courtroom, a phrase like that lands with the weight of a guilty verdict. When a whistleblower files under the False Claims Act, the U.S. Department of Justice, DOJ, usually gets a first look. They can choose to intervene and take over the case, or they can step back and let the whistleblower run it themselves. In this case, after 4 years under seal, the DOJ decided not to intervene. This was a big deal. It meant Beverly Brown would be going toe-to-toe with a multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical giant without the federal government as her tag team partner. Most whistleblowers fold when the DOJ steps aside. The risks are high, and the legal costs can be staggering. But Brown didn't back down. Instead, her case was unsealed in 2014, and she prepared to fight it out in court on her own, with the help of a private legal team that likely knew they were walking into the legal equivalent of David versus Goliath. Who was Beverly Brown? While much of her personal life stayed out of the headlines, Beverly Brown's professional profile gave her credibility. She wasn't some disgruntled employee fresh off a bad performance review, she was a seasoned sales manager who knew Celgene's products inside and out. According to court documents, she'd been in the trenches of pharma marketing, attending sales meetings, working on promotional campaigns, and observing firsthand how the drugs were pitched to doctors. In legal terms, that's called having inside knowledge, the golden ticket for any whistleblower case. To understand why this case would eventually shake up the industry, you have to get into the specifics of the allegations. Court filings described a multi-pronged strategy for pushing Thalomid and Revlimid beyond their approved uses. 1. Targeting oncologists for off-label uses. Celgene sales reps allegedly pushed the drugs for cancers like chronic lymphocytic leukemia and other blood disorders that were not FDA-approved indications. 2. Educational events that were more sales pitch than science. Celgene allegedly hosted educational speaker programs where doctors were paid handsome fees to discuss the drugs, fees that prosecutors claimed were essentially thinly veiled bribes. 3. Lavish perks. Beyond speaker fees, there were claims of expensive dinners, travel reimbursements, and consulting contracts that conveniently went to high-prescribing doctors. 4. Pressure tactics inside the company. According to Brown's filings, sales reps were evaluated not just on how many prescriptions they generated in approved areas, but on their ability to drive sales in new, unapproved markets. In one filing, Brown's lawyers described Celgene's tactics as building the plane while flying it, a phrase that might get a chuckle in a startup pitch meeting, but in medicine, it's more like telling passengers, "We'll install the wings once we're airborne, trust us." Public risks of off-label promotion. Part of what made this case so significant was the potential public health risk. Off-label uses can sometimes be supported by emerging research, but without FDA approval, there's no guarantee of safety or efficacy for that specific use. Critics argued that promoting unapproved uses for drugs like Thalomid, a drug with a notorious history due to its birth defect, causing effects in the 1950s, wasn't just a legal violation, it was a gamble with patient safety. At this stage, 2010 to 2014, Celgene officially denied any wrongdoing. In corporate statements, the company emphasized that it complied with the law and marketed its products responsibly. That's standard protocol in such cases: deny, investigate internally, and keep selling your product while the lawyers earn their billable hours. Mounting evidence and witnesses. While not all witness testimony became public during this stage, reports indicate that Brown's legal team collected internal emails, sales training documents, and testimony from former colleagues. Each piece of evidence painted a picture of a sales culture laser-focused on growth, regardless of whether that growth came from FDA-approved indications. The stakes. By the time the case went public in 2014, the stakes were enormous. If Brown won, Celgene could be liable for triple damages under the False Claims Act, plus civil penalties for each false claim submitted. Reputation. For a company in the competitive oncology drug market, a fraud case could erode trust with doctors, regulators, and investors. Precedent. A win for Brown without government intervention would embolden other whistleblowers to push forward solo. Setting the stage for the next phase. With the lawsuit unsealed in 2014, the gloves came off. Celgene would mount a defense that framed the allegations as overreach, arguing that they had the right to share certain information about drugs with physicians. Brown's team, meanwhile, positioned themselves as defenders of taxpayer dollars and patient safety. The next few years would bring a flurry of motions, negotiations, and legal chess moves. And as we'll see in the next part of this narrative, the fight didn't just stay in the courtroom, it spilled into public view, drawing in states' attorneys general, medical ethics debates, and some eyebrow-raising corporate tactics. Unsealing the case, 2014. When Beverly Brown's lawsuit was unsealed in 2014, it was like the curtain finally rising on a play that had been rehearsed for years. The public could now read her allegations in full, and Celgene, once shielded by the secrecy of sealed proceedings, was suddenly facing headlines. The media reports were blunt. Celgene accused of off-label marketing and paying kickbacks to doctors. For a company that had built its reputation on cancer innovation, that's the kind of headline that can make investors spill their morning coffee. Celgene came out swinging. In early filings, the company denied any wrongdoing, asserting that it had complied with all laws and regulations governing pharmaceutical marketing. Their legal team argued that much of what Brown described fell under legitimate, scientific exchange between drug companies and healthcare providers. In simpler terms, Celgene's lawyers claimed they were merely sharing valuable medical information, not running a prescription-pushing scheme. They pushed the idea that doctors have the final say on prescribing decisions, and the company was simply educating them on all possible uses, approved or not. The role of the False Claims Act without DOJ intervention. This was not a typical whistleblower case. Normally, if the U.S. Department of Justice intervenes, they bring the full weight of federal prosecutors and investigative resources. But here, the DOJ had passed. That meant Brown's legal team had to shoulder the entire burden, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, handling motions, and preparing for a trial against a multi-billion-dollar opponent. The challenge? Celgene had the resources to file motion after motion, delaying proceedings, challenging evidence, and generally wearing down the opposition. Think of it like playing chess against someone with an unlimited number of queens. They can attack from every direction. One of the more interesting twists in this phase came when several state governments started paying attention. Medicaid, the state federal health program for low-income Americans, had allegedly been billed for off-label prescriptions of Thalomid and Revlimid. According to later settlement documents, 28 states and the District of Columbia would eventually join the resolution. But between 2014 and 2016, state attorneys general were already gathering information, watching the federal case closely, and preparing to stake their claim to any potential payout. Brown's evidence strategy. Brown's team reportedly focused on three main pillars of evidence. 1. Internal documents, emails, sales training manuals, and marketing plans that allegedly encouraged sales reps to target unapproved uses. 2. Witness testimony, statements from former Celgene employees, sales managers, and doctors who attended company events. 3. Financial data, prescription patterns, payment records to physicians, and reimbursement claims submitted to government programs. One internal email, according to filings, showed a sales director urging reps to maximize all markets for Revlimid, a phrase that, in the context of a regulated drug, can sound like code for find customers anywhere, approved or not. Brown's lawyers leaned into such language in court filings, presenting it as evidence of a corporate culture driven by revenue goals over patient safety. Celgene's counterargument. Celgene, for its part, didn't just sit quietly in the defendant's chair. They launched a counter-narrative. Educational intent. They claimed that their speaker programs, dinners, and conferences were legitimate educational opportunities for doctors. First Amendment defense. Some arguments hinted at the idea that sharing truthful, non-misleading information, even about unapproved uses, could be protected speech. Doctor autonomy. They stressed that physicians make independent decisions and that the company merely provides scientific data. This wasn't just legal positioning, it was strategic. By framing the issue as one of free speech and medical independence, Celgene sought to shift the conversation from fraud to professional discourse. Discovery battles. If you've ever seen a legal drama, you know that discovery phase, where both sides exchange evidence, can be as tense as the trial itself. Between 2014 and 2016, the discovery phase here was brutal. Celgene's lawyers fought to limit what documents could be used, citing confidentiality, trade secrets, and relevance objections. Brown's side pushed for wide access, arguing that without full transparency, the scope of the alleged misconduct couldn't be proven. This back and forth produced thousands of pages of documents, some of which would later be key in pushing Celgene toward settlement. While the legal battle raged, news outlets occasionally ran updates on the case. It wasn't front-page material every day, but the story had legs. A prominent pharmaceutical company. A whistleblower who refused to quit despite no DOJ backing. Allegations involving cancer drugs, where emotions and ethics run high. Public perception mattered because in high-profile corporate cases, negative press can pressure a company toward settlement, even if they believe they could win in court. By 2016, both sides were doing math. Under the False Claims Act, damages can be tripled. If Celgene had caused millions in false claims to be submitted to Medicare and Medicaid, the final judgment could have been staggering, potentially over $1 billion when penalties were added. For Celgene, the calculation was clear: fighting the case to the bitter end might save face if they won, but if they lost, the financial and reputational cost could be devastating. For Brown, the risk was also high. Whistleblower cases without government backing can fail outright, leaving the relator with nothing but legal bills. But by this stage, her evidence pile was large enough to keep negotiations alive. This phase of the case was a bit like a poker game in an Old West saloon, except the cards were thousands of pages of legal filings, and instead of a six-shooter, each side had an army of attorneys ready to draw motions at a moment's notice. The quiet settlement talks begin. By late 2016, there were signs that both sides were testing the waters for a settlement. In many big cases, public posturing continues even as private negotiations happen behind closed doors. Settlement talks often follow a pattern: one side floats a number, the other scoffs, then both retreat to their corners. Weeks later, another number comes up, and the dance repeats. Each proposal weighs the cost of continuing litigation versus the certainty of a payout now. The $280 million settlement, 2017. The final year of pressure. By early 2017, the Celgene whistleblower case had been grinding through the legal system for 7 years. Beverly Brown and her legal team had survived the long haul, motions to dismiss, exhaustive discovery battles, and the constant threat of being outspent by a pharmaceutical giant with deep pockets. Behind the scenes, the pressure on Celgene had only grown. Multiple states had now formally joined the action, claiming that their Medicaid programs had been billed for off-label prescriptions pushed by Celgene's alleged marketing tactics. Federal and state attorneys had the same interest. If Celgene lost in court, the payout would be massive. Celgene's leadership faced a cold calculation: continue to fight, risking a trial with potentially ruinous damages, or settle and control the outcome. Settlement discussions that began quietly in late 2016 became more serious in the first half of 2017. Negotiators for Brown's legal team and Celgene's defense counsel met multiple times to hash out terms. These weren't polite tea-time chats. They were high-stakes exchanges where each side came armed with numbers, evidence summaries, and legal arguments sharpened like knives. In these talks, Brown's side likely emphasized the strength of documentary evidence, internal emails, sales training materials, and marketing plans suggesting off-label targeting. The testimony from physicians and former employees that could play poorly in front of a jury. The potential treble damages under the False Claims Act, which could push liability into the billion-dollar range. Celgene's side likely countered with the uncertainty of trial outcomes, even with strong evidence. Legal arguments around scientific exchange and First Amendment protections. The point that the U.S. Department of Justice had declined to intervene, suggesting, in their view, that the case lacked full governmental endorsement. The agreement, July 2017. On July 24, 2017, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Central District of California announced that Celgene Corporation had agreed to pay $280 million to settle the allegations. The deal broke down as follows. $259.3 million went to the federal government. $20.7 million went to 28 states and the District of Columbia. The settlement resolved allegations that Celgene violated the False Claims Act by promoting Thalomid and Revlimid for unapproved uses and paying kickbacks to doctors to prescribe them. As is typical in such settlements, Celgene did not admit liability. In public statements, the company emphasized that the agreement was a way to avoid the uncertainty, distraction, and cost of prolonged litigation. Celgene's statement read in part, "We continue to believe our marketing practices were lawful and appropriate. This settlement allows us to avoid the distraction of continued litigation and to focus on our mission of helping patients. In other words, we don't agree we did anything wrong, but here's $280 million so we can all move on." Statements from prosecutors and attorneys general. While Celgene stayed on the defensive, federal and state authorities framed the settlement as a victory for taxpayers and a warning to the pharmaceutical industry. Nicola T. Hanna, then acting U.S. Attorney for the Central District of California, said, "This settlement demonstrates our commitment to ensuring that drug manufacturers do not improperly influence how physicians prescribe medications." Similarly, New Hampshire Attorney General Gordon MacDonald stated, "The Medicaid program must be protected from companies that attempt to increase profits at the expense of taxpayers and patients." These statements underscored the core legal theory of the case, not that off-label use itself is inherently illegal, but that promoting it, and causing the submission of false claims to government healthcare programs, is the whistleblower's reward. Under the False Claims Act, whistleblowers who prevail in their cases receive a portion of the recovery. Beverly Brown's share was significant. While the exact figure varied slightly in different reports, court documents indicated that Brown received tens of millions of dollars as her relator's share. For a case she pursued without DOJ intervention, it was one of the largest individual whistleblower payouts in history. And it wasn't just about the money. Brown had succeeded where many fail, forcing a settlement from one of the biggest players in biotech without the U.S. government leading the charge. This case stood out for several reasons. 1. Non-intervened size. At $280 million, it became one of the largest False Claims Act settlements ever achieved without government intervention. 2. Pharma marketing scrutiny. It added to a growing list of high-profile cases against drug companies accused of blurring the line between education and promotion. 3. Whistleblower tenacity. Brown's persistence showed other insiders that it was possible to take on corporate giants without DOJ backing, though few would envy the grueling process. In the old days, they said you could tell a man by the company he keeps. In modern corporate America, you can tell a company by the lawyers it hires, and by how much it's willing to pay to make those lawyers stop sending emails at 3 a.m. The settlement drew measured reactions. Patient advocacy groups praised the outcome as a step toward accountability, while industry insiders saw it as a reminder of the fine line in pharma marketing. Investors shrugged off the hit. Celgene's stock dipped briefly but remained strong, reflecting the fact that the company could absorb the payout without a long-term dent in its bottom line. Some critics argued that $280 million was just a cost of doing business for a firm with billions in annual revenue. Others countered that the reputational damage and compliance monitoring requirements carried weight beyond the dollar figure. While Celgene did not admit wrongdoing, settlements of this nature often lead to internal changes, tighter compliance protocols, more rigorous training for sales reps, and stricter oversight of interactions with healthcare providers. Public filings after the settlement suggested that Celgene, like other companies in similar situations, strengthened its corporate compliance department and refined policies on how information about unapproved uses could be shared. By late 2017, the case was officially closed in legal terms, but its effects rippled through the pharmaceutical industry. Whistleblower attorneys cited it as precedent when encouraging other insiders to come forward. States, meanwhile, became more aggressive in pursuing Medicaid fraud cases tied to drug marketing. For Beverly Brown, the fight was over, at least in court. For Celgene, the lesson was likely learned, if only because the legal bill and settlement check made for a very expensive reminder. When the ink dried on the July 2017 settlement, Celgene could officially close the book on one of the most expensive whistleblower cases it had ever faced. But in reality, the story didn't end, it simply entered a new chapter. For a company in the biotech sector, paying $280 million was painful but not fatal. Celgene's annual revenues for 2017 topped $13 billion, so the payout represented about 2% of yearly income. In other words, it was a costly slap on the wrist, but not a knockout punch. Still, the reputational damage was harder to quantify. Once a company is publicly linked to allegations of off-label promotion and kickbacks, those headlines live forever in the age of online archives. Post-settlement, Celgene, like any pharmaceutical firm in similar circumstances, tightened its compliance protocols. Although the settlement agreement did not include a formal Corporate Integrity Agreement, CIA, with the Department of Health and Human Services, the expectation from regulators and investors was clear: avoid a sequel at all costs. Industry analysts noted several likely steps Celgene would have taken internally. Expanded training for sales representatives, emphasizing strict adherence to FDA-approved labeling. A stronger internal review of all marketing materials before distribution. The closer monitoring of speaker programs and physician interactions to reduce the risk of kickback allegations. A former compliance officer, speaking in a trade journal interview, summed it up bluntly. After a case like this, you don't just tell your reps to play by the book, you staple the book to their forehead if you have to. The Celgene case quickly became a talking point for whistleblower attorneys across the United States. Beverly Brown had done something rare. She took on a major pharmaceutical company without the Department of Justice intervening and still secured one of the largest False Claims Act settlements in history. Legal conferences in 2018 and 2019 often cited Brown versus Celgene as proof that non-intervened cases could succeed if backed by strong evidence and relentless pursuit. This emboldened other would-be whistleblowers to step forward, though attorneys were quick to remind them that Brown's outcome was the exception, not the rule. In the broader pharmaceutical industry, the Celgene settlement reinforced an uncomfortable truth: even without criminal charges, civil penalties for off-label promotion could reach into the hundreds of millions. Companies began reviewing their speaker bureau programs, advisory board payments, and educational events with fresh caution. The fine line between scientific discussion and sales pitch became even more scrutinized. State attorneys general, having pocketed their share of the Celgene settlement, were reminded of the financial and political benefits of pursuing similar cases. As a result, states became more aggressive in investigating Medicaid fraud linked to pharmaceutical marketing. Interestingly, the settlement didn't cripple Celgene's long-term prospects. In January 2019, less than 2 years later, Bristol Myers Squibb announced plans to acquire Celgene in a $74 billion deal, one of the largest pharma mergers in history. Analysts noted that while the 2017 settlement was a blemish, Celgene's strong drug pipeline and revenue growth outweighed the reputational hit in the eyes of investors. Still, during acquisition due diligence, the case was part of the conversation, serving as a reminder of the company's regulatory risk profile. In public memory, the Celgene case remains a cautionary tale. For corporate compliance professionals, it's Exhibit A in why off-label marketing can turn into a multi-year, multi-million-dollar legal nightmare. For whistleblower advocates, it's a rallying cry: one determined insider, armed with evidence and the right legal team, can hold a multi-billion-dollar corporation accountable, even without Uncle Sam leading the charge. For Beverly Brown, it was the closing act in a long, exhausting battle. She emerged financially secure and publicly vindicated, though not without the personal and professional toll that comes from taking on a former employer in court. In the days of the Wild West, folks used to say, if you can't beat the sheriff, you'd best pay the fine and get out of town before sundown. In the modern biotech frontier, it seems the rule is, if you can't beat the whistleblower, you'd best cut the check and beef up compliance before the next one comes knocking. By the close of 2017, Celgene had paid out the $280 million settlement in full, roughly $259.3 million to the federal government and $20.7 million to 28 states and the District of Columbia. The company did not admit wrongdoing, but the agreement resolved the allegations brought forward by Beverly Brown, a former sales manager who became the whistleblower at the center of the case. Brown's persistence earned her a whistleblower award, reportedly $78 million, a portion of the settlement as provided under the False Claims Act. It was both a financial windfall and a symbolic victory, proof that individual insiders could force corporate giants to answer for misconduct. Celgene, for its part, moved forward with business largely intact. Revlimid and other core products continued to generate billions in annual sales. The company implemented stricter internal safeguards and doubled down on compliance messaging to its sales force. By early 2019, the shadow of the settlement was partially eclipsed by bigger corporate news. Bristol Myers Squibb's $74 billion acquisition of Celgene, completed in November 2019. From a purely financial perspective, the scandal was a storm Celgene weathered. From an ethical and reputational standpoint, the stain lingered, etched in court filings, press archives, and compliance training slides for years to come. The Celgene case continues to resonate because it encapsulates several lessons. 1. Off-label marketing is risky territory. While physicians can legally prescribe drugs for unapproved uses, pharmaceutical companies are prohibited from promoting them for those purposes. Crossing that line invites intense legal scrutiny. 2. Whistleblowers can succeed without government intervention. Beverly Brown's case stands out because the Department of Justice declined to take over, yet the outcome still ranks among the largest such settlements in U.S. history. 3. Settlements don't always sink companies. Celgene's revenue base and product portfolio meant it could absorb the financial hit, but smaller firms might not be so resilient. 4. States are active players. The inclusion of 28 states and D.C. in the settlement shows that state governments are increasingly willing to join in on federal fraud cases, especially when Medicaid funds are implicated. Behind the courtroom documents and corporate press releases, this was also the story of a professional who faced a choice: remain silent or speak out. Brown claimed she had watched years of aggressive marketing practices that blurred, and sometimes crossed, legal boundaries. Taking the step to file under the False Claims Act meant stepping into a grueling, multi-year legal process, one that could have ended in personal and financial ruin had she lost. Her success not only brought restitution to government programs but also reinforced the structural role whistleblowers play in safeguarding public funds and patient safety. Back in the 1800s, town criers would end with, "Let this be a warning to the unruly." In our modern, high-stakes pharmaceutical world, the warning still rings true: just replace horses with stock tickers, and saloons with boardrooms. Celgene's saga is a reminder: when the rules of the game are bent for profit, someone, somewhere, will eventually blow the whistle, and the echoes will be costly. If you work in healthcare, pharma, or any industry tied to public funds, know the rules and know your rights. Understand that whistleblower protections exist for a reason, and the False Claims Act remains one of the most powerful tools for uncovering fraud. If you see misconduct, document it. Seek legal advice early. For the public, stay informed. The drugs we take, the programs we fund, and the companies we trust all operate in an environment where ethics and profit sometimes collide. Cases like Celgene's remind us that vigilance isn't optional, it's essential. And to those in the boardrooms, the next Beverly Brown might already be in your conference call, quietly taking notes. The choice is yours: run a clean shop or risk your own multi-million-dollar headline.